The med bay was quiet, filled with the soft hum of alien machines, their smooth bioluminescent surfaces pulsing in time with the distant beat of the ship's engines. Silura, nurse from the planet Verundus, stood at the examination table, her multi-jointed hands hovering above the unconscious figure of a human male. She had encountered many life forms in her years of intergalactic medical service, but this was different. Her curiosity had been piqued ever since the human had been brought aboard after a near-fatal accident on a distant moon. Now, standing before him, she felt a strange mix of professional duty and something else, something more personal. She had heard stories of humans, their resilience, their ability to adapt to the most hostile environments. But seeing one up close was a revelation. His body was unlike anything she had seen before. He appeared fragile, softer than the creatures she usually worked on. But Silura knew better. The humans had a reputation for surviving against impossible odds. And now, as she prepared to examine his physiology, she understood why that fascinated so many. With a smooth motion, Silura adjusted her visor, bringing up a holographic display of the human's anatomy. Her twin hearts beat a little faster as the medical scanner lit up, revealing a complex and chaotic network of organs, muscles, and blood vessels. She traced the outline of his chest, her fingers brushing just above his skin, wondering how such a delicate-looking being could possess such strength. Silura's species, the Verundi, had evolved with a symmetrical, efficient body structure. Their dual hearts and layered neural pathways were logical, optimized for survival. The human's body, by comparison, seemed almost haphazard, but there was beauty in that chaos, the kind of order hidden within the disorder. It intrigued her deeply. She pressed a button, and the examination began. As she made the first incision, she was immediately struck by the color of his blood. Red, so different from the azure liquid that flowed through her veins. The sight of it fascinated her. She studied the slow rise and fall of his chest, his heart beating in a steady rhythm, and felt an inexplicable connection to the human on the table. "What makes you so resilient?" Silura murmured to herself, her voice low and reflective. The human's internal structure was no less mesmerizing. As she peeled back the layers of muscle and tissue, Silura found herself lost in wonder at the delicate balance that kept his body functioning. His heart, smaller than she expected, pumped with surprising intensity. She watched, captivated, as it contracted and expanded, driving life through the complex web of arteries and veins. This was more than just a routine examination. Silura felt as though she were witnessing something profound, something that went beyond the physical. Her long fingers hesitated over his heart, sensing a power she couldn't fully understand. Was this the secret to human survival? Their sheer refusal to give up? A soft sound escaped the human's lips, and Silura froze. He shouldn't have woken yet. The sedative should have kept him unconscious for hours. But there it was again. Low groan, barely audible. His eyelids fluttered, and his pulse quickened under her fingertips. Her breath caught. This wasn't supposed to happen, but as his eyes slowly opened, revealing stormy gray irises, Silura felt a strange thrill. She should have administered more anesthetic, but something in his gaze stopped her. There was a fire in his eyes, a spark of life that pulled her in, deeper than she ever intended to go. "Where?" His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to send a jolt of excitement through her. For the first time in her medical career, Silura hesitated. Her scientific detachment was slipping, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop it. The human was awake, and he was looking at her, not with fear, but with curiosity that mirrored her own. Silura stood motionless, staring into the human's eyes as they slowly focused on her. His pupils dilated, adjusting to the dim light of the med bay. His gaze swept across the room before returning to her. She could see the questions forming in his mind, the confusion mixing with curiosity. "You're an alien," he said softly, his voice hoarse but calm. He didn't seem afraid, more bewildered than anything. Silara's mandibles twitched slightly, an involuntary response to the unexpected calm in his voice. "I am," she replied, keeping her tone even. "And you are aboard a Verundi medical vessel." The human blinked, his brow furrowing as he processed her words. His gaze drifted down to his chest, where the incision she had made was still visible, though carefully stitched up by her precise hands. "You were operating on me?" he asked, his voice slightly stronger now. Silara nodded. "You were injured. We brought you aboard to ensure your survival." The human shifted slightly on the examination table, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. "I see," he muttered, before turning his gaze back to her. "Thank you." The simplicity of his gratitude took Silara by surprise. She had performed countless surgeries, saved lives across multiple systems, but never before had a patient thanked her so sincerely. It was a small gesture, yet it resonated with her deeply. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice softening. Something about this human made her feel different. It wasn't just professional duty anymore. There was a connection forming, one she hadn't anticipated. The human shifted again, his eyes never leaving hers. "What's your name?" he asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "I am Silara," she said, feeling an odd sense of pride as she spoke her name. He smiled weakly. "I'm Daniel." There it was. A name. Silara hadn't realized how much she wanted to know his name until he said it. Daniel. It felt strange, yet comforting. This human was no longer just a subject on her table. He was a person with a name, a life, a history. For a moment, Silara felt the weight of her training pressing down on her. She had always been taught to maintain emotional distance from her patients, to remain objective. But with Daniel lying there, looking at her with those stormy eyes, she found it harder and harder to stay detached. "What is Earth like?" she asked suddenly, surprising even herself. The question had slipped out before she could stop it, but she realized it was something she truly wanted to know. Daniel's expression softened as he thought about his home. "Earth. It's chaotic, dangerous, unpredictable." He paused, a faint smile playing on his lips. "But it's beautiful too. There's nothing else like it." Silara listened intently, her twin hearts beating faster with each word. She could see the emotions flickering across his face as he spoke: pride, longing, and something deeper, something that spoke of a bond with his home that went beyond logic or reason. As he continued to talk, Silara felt a warmth growing inside her, a strange and unfamiliar sensation. She had never cared about a patient's world before, never asked questions about their lives. But with Daniel, it was different. She wanted to understand him, not just his body, but his mind, his soul. For a moment, Silara hesitated, unsure of what this new feeling meant. Was it simple curiosity, or something deeper? She had treated so many species, had been exposed to so many different cultures, but none had ever affected her like this human. Daniel was not like the others. He was resilient, strong, but also vulnerable in a way that intrigued her. As he finished talking about Earth, Daniel turned the question back on her. "And what about you? What's your world like?" Silara blinked, taken aback by his interest. Few outsiders ever asked about Verundi homeworlds. Most were too focused on their own survival, or too wary of her species to care. But Daniel was different. "My world," she began slowly, trying to find the right words to describe something so vast. "It is peaceful, orderly. The landscapes are vast and varied, from the shimmering lakes of Ixer to the towering crystal spires of the capital. But life there is structured, predictable." Daniel raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a small grin. "Sounds like the opposite of Earth." Brief smile tugged at Silara's mandibles. "It is. Our society values control and precision above all else. Everything is planned, from our births to our deaths. There is little room for chaos." Daniel chuckled, though it was clear the action caused him some discomfort. "Sounds nice in a way. But don't you ever get tired of it? The predictability, I mean. Silara's mandibles twitched again, a sign of her internal conflict. I used to think that structure was necessary, that it kept us safe and strong. But now, she trailed off, her gaze drifting away for a moment before snapping back to him. I'm starting to wonder if there is more, if chaos, as you call it, has its own kind of beauty. Daniel smiled at her, and the warmth in his eyes seemed to reach out and touch her in a way she had never experienced before. Trust me, chaos can be terrifying, but it can also be freeing. It's what makes life, life. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but rather filled with an unspoken understanding. Two beings from entirely different worlds, yet somehow, in that moment, they were connected by something greater than their species, their roles, or their duties. Silara broke the silence first, her voice softer than before. Your recovery will take time, but you will survive. I will ensure it. Daniel nodded, his gaze never wavering from hers. I believe you, he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that took her by surprise. She had never been one to seek validation from her patients, but hearing Daniel's trust in her, so simple, so unguarded, filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. As she turned to leave, Daniel called after her, his voice low but filled with something unspoken. Silara. She paused, looking back at him. Thank you, he said again, his eyes filled with gratitude and something more, a deeper connection, perhaps, or a growing bond that neither of them fully understood yet. Silara nodded slowly, her twin hearts beating in sync with the strange warmth that filled her chest. Rest, Daniel. You'll need your strength. With that, she exited the medbay, but as the door slid shut behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something profound and irreversible had begun between them. And for the first time in her life, Silara welcomed the unknown. In the days that followed, Daniel's recovery progressed steadily under Silara's careful watch. She had become more than just his surgeon. She was his guide to this strange new reality aboard the Verundite medical vessel. Every interaction with him felt like peeling back the layers of a mystery, revealing more about humanity's essence than she had ever imagined. As Silara entered the medbay one morning, she found Daniel sitting up on the examination table, his eyes scanning the holographic displays that floated above his bed. His color had returned, and the sharpness in his gaze showed a strength that was quickly returning. You seem to be recovering well, Silara noted as she approached, her eyes quickly assessing his condition with a clinical precision she always maintained, though her emotions felt less clinical these days. Yeah, thanks to you. Daniel grinned, glancing over at her. I'm starting to feel like myself again. But I still don't quite understand. Why did you help me? The question lingered in the air for a moment. Silara had asked herself the same thing. Her species, the Verundi, were known for their strict adherence to protocols, especially when it came to interacting with other species. Taking in an injured human, an outsider, a potential threat, had been a decision driven by more than mere duty. We are healers, she began, though her words lacked the detachment she had intended. It is our purpose to save lives, regardless of species or origin. Daniel studied her, his expression thoughtful. But it feels like more than that. Silara stiffened slightly. He was perceptive, and there was no point in denying what she felt stirring inside her. She had come to admire Daniel's resilience, his courage in the face of the unknown. And more than that, there was something about his humanity that tugged at her in ways she couldn't explain. I suppose it is, she admitted softly. Your strength, it's unlike anything I've encountered. Humans, your people, are unpredictable, chaotic, but there's something about that which draws me in. Daniel chuckled, the sound low and genuine. Yeah, we're known for being a bit unpredictable, but I think that's what makes us so adaptable. Silara nodded. I've seen that. Despite everything you've endured, you don't seem afraid. Fear doesn't get you far in situations like this. Daniel replied, his tone growing serious. And right now, I don't have time to be afraid. There's something bigger going on here, isn't there? Solara felt a tension creep into her spine. Daniel wasn't wrong. There was more happening aboard the ship than she had initially let on. His arrival had complicated matters. The Verundi were involved in a delicate situation with several other species, and tensions in this sector of space were rising. The humans' presence aboard their ship would not go unnoticed for long. I can't say too much, she began, her voice lowering. But the Verundi are not the only ones who know of your existence. There are other factions. Others who may not have had such benevolent intentions toward you. Daniel's expression darkened. Who? Before Solara could respond, a sharp alarm blared through the medbay. The ship's lights flickered, and the gentle hum of the engines shifted into an ominous rumble. Solara's mandibles flared in surprise, her hand instinctively reaching for the wall-mounted display. The ship is under attack, she said, her voice steady despite the rising tension in her chest. Daniel swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing slightly as the movement tugged at his stitches. Who's attacking? Solara's fingers flew across the holographic console, bringing up the external visuals. Her twin hearts sank as she saw the familiar angular shapes of the approaching ships. The Kravak, she muttered, her mandibles clenching. They're mercenaries, and they've been hunting humans in this sector. Daniel's jaw tightened. Why? The Kravak are hired by rival factions, species that see humanity as a threat to their expansion. You were an unexpected discovery, but they must have followed our ship after we rescued you. Solara turned to Daniel, her mind racing. The Verundi were skilled in diplomacy and medicine, but they weren't warriors. The Kravak, on the other hand, were relentless. You need to stay here, she ordered, her voice firm. It's too dangerous. But Daniel was already moving. I'm not just going to sit around while we're under attack. Solara felt a mixture of admiration and frustration surge within her. Of course he wouldn't. He was human, determined, stubborn, and completely unyielding in the face of danger. Then you'll need this, she said, pulling a small device from the wall. She handed it to him. A compact Verundi energy shield, designed to deflect energy-based weapons. It won't last long, but it should protect you in a fight. Daniel took the device and strapped it onto his wrist, giving her a nod of thanks. I'll take whatever help I can get. Just then, the ship rocked violently, throwing Solara off balance. Daniel reached out instinctively, steadying her before she could fall. For a moment, their eyes met again, and that strange connection between them flared, stronger now, as if solidified by the danger surrounding them. Stay close, Solara said, her voice soft but determined. I'll get you to the armory. Together, they moved through the ship, the corridors flashing with red emergency lights as the battle raged outside. Solara led the way, her mind focused on one thing, keeping Daniel safe. But with the Kravak bearing down on them, she knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger fight, one that would test their bond in ways neither of them could have foreseen. As they reached the armory, Solara's twin hearts raced not from fear, but from something else. She couldn't deny it anymore. She was drawn to Daniel, to his unpredictability, his courage. But as the next wave of explosions rocked the ship, she realized that the connection growing between them could either be their greatest strength or their undoing. The armory was dimly lit, its shelves filled with alien weapons that Daniel had never seen before. The sleek designs and unfamiliar technology made him uneasy, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Solara moved swiftly, pulling out gear with precision, her every movement a testament to her training and focus. These are Verundi pulse rifles, Solara explained, handing Daniel a compact, silver weapon. They're designed for precision at close range. It will be effective against the Kravak, but their armor is tough. You'll need to aim for weak spots, under the arms, the neck, or behind the knees. Daniel inspected the rifle, its weight surprisingly light in his hands. Got it, he said, his tone steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. He felt the adrenaline pumping through his veins, a familiar sensation from his days in combat. But this time, the stakes felt different. It wasn't just survival, it was protecting something, someone, far more important. Scylla strapped on her own gear, securing a shield generator to her arm and holstering a sleek sidearm at her waist. She paused for a moment, looking at Daniel, her amber eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and something more personal. "I won't let anything happen to you," she said, her voice quieter now, almost tender. "Not after everything we've been through." Daniel nodded, meeting her gaze. "Same here. We're in this together." The ship lurched violently again. Another hit from the Kravak assault, and the two of them moved swiftly toward the exit. As they stepped into the corridor, they could hear the distant sounds of combat. Verundi crew members shouting orders, energy weapons discharging, and the faint, ominous sound of Kravak war cries echoing through the ship. They hurried toward the bridge, where Scylla knew they'd need to regroup and plan their next move. But as they turned a corner, the air around them shifted. Low hum, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "Hold up," Daniel whispered, his senses on high alert. "Do you hear that?" Scylla froze, her hand hovering over her sidearm. The hum was unmistakable now. "Cloaked scouts," she muttered. "They're using stealth tech to infiltrate the ship." As if on cue, the shadows in the corridor seemed to ripple, and two Kravak soldiers materialized out of thin air, their jagged forms towering over both Scylla and Daniel. Their armor gleamed, a sickly metallic sheen under the emergency lights, and their faces were hidden behind menacing helmets that emitted a low, guttural growl. Without hesitation, Scylla fired first, her pulse rifle releasing a burst of energy that crackled through the air. One of the Kravak dodged with inhuman speed, ducking to the side as the blast grazed its armor. The other lunged forward, its massive clawed hand swinging toward Daniel with brutal force. Daniel reacted instinctively, diving to the side as the Kravak's blow missed him by inches. He rolled to his feet, raising the pulse rifle and firing at the weak spot Scylla had pointed out, the underarm. The blast hit home, the Kravak soldier staggering back as its armor cracked and a low, animalistic growl escaped its throat. Scylla moved like a blur, her training as a surgeon giving her precision in movement. She dodged the second Kravak's attack, spinning around to aim for the neck, her pulse rifle humming with energy as she pulled the trigger. The blast struck true, and the Kravak soldier fell, collapsing in a heap of smoking metal. Daniel took down the first Kravak with a second shot to the exposed area under its armor. Watching as it crumpled to the floor, twitching before going still, he breathed heavily, the weight of the moment settling in. These were no ordinary opponents. They were relentless, trained killers. "Nice shot," Scylla said, her voice steady but with a flicker of admiration. "Not bad yourself," Daniel replied, catching his breath. But there was no time to celebrate. The sounds of battle were growing closer, and the ship shook again from another impact. They had to keep moving. "We need to get to the command center," Scylla said urgently. "If the Kravak reach the bridge, it's over. They'll take control of the ship." They hurried through the winding corridors, passing injured crew members and soldiers locked in combat with Kravak invaders. Daniel's pulse quickened as the weight of the situation settled in. This wasn't just about his survival anymore. Scylla's people were in danger, and if the Kravak took the ship, countless lives could be lost. As they neared the bridge, the door slid open with a hiss, revealing a chaotic scene. Verundi officers were scrambling to maintain control of the ship's systems, while the captain, a tall, imposing figure with intricate markings along his exoskeleton, barked orders. "Scylla," the captain called out, relief evident in his voice as he spotted her. His eyes flicked toward Daniel, and his mandibles clicked in surprise. "The human is awake." "Yes, Captain," Scylla replied. "And he's helped us repel a Kravak scout team. but the main force is still pressing their attack. We need to act fast." The captain's gaze settled on Daniel, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded, his tone shifting to one of respect. "You saved some of my crew. For that, I am in your debt, human." Daniel nodded, his mind still racing as he processed the situation. "We need to focus on stopping the Kravak from boarding any further. What's the plan?" The captain turned back to the central console, bringing up a holographic display of the ship's systems. "We have one option," he said gravely. "The Kravak ships have lashed onto us with magnetic grapplers. If we can disable their power cores, it will force them to disengage. But the only way to do that is through a direct assault on their boarding vessel." "Let me go," Daniel said immediately, his voice steady with resolve. Silora turned to him, her eyes widening. "You can't be serious. That's suicide." "It's not," Daniel insisted, his gaze firm. "I've been in worse situations. I can get in, disable the cores, and get out, but I'll need someone with me." Silora's mandibles twitched as she weighed the risks, her twin hearts pounding in her chest. She wanted to protect him, to keep him safe, but she also knew Daniel was right. He was the best chance they had. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, a silent understanding passing between them. They were walking into the fire together, and there was no turning back. "Let's do this," he said, his pulse rifle in hand. As they prepared to board the enemy ship, Silora felt the weight of her decisions. This mission wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust, loyalty, and the bond that had formed between her and Daniel. A bond that could either lead them to victory or to their doom. Daniel and Silora moved swiftly through the cramped corridors of the Verundi vessel, making their way to the airlock where the Kravak boarding ship was anchored. Each step brought them closer to the heart of the conflict, and the tension between them grew. Unspoken but undeniable. The ship shuddered again, another hit from the Kravak fleet battering its shields. Sparks flew from an overloaded console as they passed, the stench of burning circuitry filling the air. Crew members scrambled around them, but Daniel's focus remained sharp, his pulse rifle gripped tightly in his hands. "They'll be ready for us," Silora said quietly as they reached the airlock. Her amber eyes glanced at Daniel, searching for any sign of hesitation. Daniel met her gaze, his expression calm. "I know." There was no time for doubt. The moment they opened the airlock, they would be stepping directly into enemy territory. It was dangerous, yes, but for Daniel, this was familiar ground. He had faced worse odds on Earth, fought against enemies just as relentless, just as deadly. The airlock door hissed open, revealing the narrow passageway that connected the two ships. On the other side, the Kravak vessel loomed, dark and foreboding. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he and Silora stepped into the breach. They moved silently, every step calculated. As they approached the Kravak ship, the low hum of its systems buzzed in their ears. Silora activated a scanner on her wrist, the small device emitting a soft glow as it mapped the interior of the enemy vessel. "There," she whispered, pointing to a blinking red dot on the holographic display. "That's the power core. It's heavily guarded." "Of course it is," Daniel muttered under his breath, glancing at the map. The core was deep within the ship, surrounded by several compartments, each likely crawling with Kravak soldiers. He tightened his grip on the pulse rifle. "We'll take it slow, one room at a time." Silora nodded, and together they advanced, slipping into the shadowy corridors of the Kravak vessel. The alien ship was cold, its walls a deep, pulsating black that seemed to absorb the dim light. The eerie silence was only broken by the occasional thrum of energy pulsing through the ship's systems. As they rounded a corner, they saw the first signs of life, two Kravak soldiers standing guard near a control room. Their forms were hulking, their jagged armor reflecting the faint light as they communicated in low, guttural growls. Daniel raised his hand, signaling Silura to stop. He scanned the area, noting the narrow passage ahead and the potential blind spots. "We take them out quietly," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We can't alert the others." Silura nodded, her mandibles twitching in agreement. She drew a small, sleek blade from her belt, its surface shimmering in the low light. Daniel motioned for her to take the soldier on the left while he approached the one on the right. They moved in unison, silent and swift. Daniel crept behind his target, the Kravak soldier unaware of his presence. With one fluid motion, he pressed the muzzle of his pulse rifle against the Kravak's exposed neck and fired. The alien crumpled to the ground without a sound. At the same time, Silura's blade flashed, slicing through the air with deadly precision. Her target fell just as quickly, its lifeless body slumping against the wall. "Clear," Daniel whispered, scanning the area for any signs of movement. When nothing stirred, he gestured for Silura to follow. They moved past the fallen guards, continuing deeper into the ship. The closer they got to the power core, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The ship's design seemed to close in on them, the walls growing narrower, the air heavier. They could hear the faint hum of machinery, the core's energy pulsating like a heartbeat. Suddenly, a sharp hiss echoed through the corridor, and the door ahead slid open. Daniel and Silura ducked into a nearby alcove, their bodies pressed against the cold metal as a group of Kravak soldiers marched past. Their armor clinked with each step, their weapons held tightly at their sides. Daniel held his breath, his pulse racing. One wrong move, and they'd be discovered. He glanced at Silura, who remained perfectly still, her amber eyes focused on the passing soldiers. Her twin hearts pounded, but her expression remained calm, controlled. As soon as the soldiers were out of sight, Daniel exhaled quietly. That was too close. Silura nodded, her mandibles twitching slightly in agreement. "We're almost there." They pressed on, finally reaching the control room just outside the power core chamber. The door was reinforced, guarded by a heavy security system. Silura knelt down, her fingers flying across the control panel as she attempted to override the lock. "Hurry," Daniel whispered, glancing over his shoulder. The tension in the air was thick, every second feeling like an eternity. "I'm trying," Silura muttered, frustration creeping into her voice. The system was more complex than she had anticipated, layers of encryption protecting the core, but she wouldn't give up, not now. Finally, with a soft click, the door slid open, revealing the power core. The room was vast, filled with pulsating energy conduits that snaked across the walls. In the center, massive glowing structure hummed, the core itself radiating power throughout the ship. But they weren't alone. A squad of Kravak soldiers stood guard, their jagged armor glinting in the glow of the core. Their eyes locked onto Daniel and Silura the moment the door opened, and within seconds, the air was filled with the sound of weapons charging. "Get down," Daniel shouted, diving behind a nearby console as energy blasts ricocheted around them. Silura ducked behind a support beam, returning fire with deadly accuracy. "We have to take out the core," Silura yelled over the din of battle. "If we don't, they'll keep boarding the ship." Daniel nodded, his mind racing. The Kravak soldiers were closing in, their firepower relentless, but he saw an opening. A weak spot in their defenses, just enough for him to make a move. "I'm going for it," Daniel shouted, rising from cover. He sprinted toward the core, dodging blasts as they zipped past him. Silura covered him, her shots precise, taking down 2 Kravak soldiers as they advanced. Daniel reached the core, his hands moving quickly to plant the charges Silura had given him. The room shook with the intensity of the battle, but he kept his focus, his heart pounding in his chest as the final charge was set. "Get back," Daniel yelled, diving for cover as the core began to overload. The Kravak soldiers, realizing what was happening, scrambled to stop him, but it was too late. With a deafening explosion, the core erupted, sending a shockwave through the ship. The lights flickered, the walls trembled, and the Kravak soldiers were thrown back, their armor shattered by the blast. Daniel and Silura lay on the floor, breathing heavily as the ship's systems failed one by one. The Kravak vessel was crippled, its power gone, leaving it defenseless. For a moment, there was silence, a brief, fleeting calm after the storm. Silura slowly sat up, her eyes scanning the room. "We did it," she breathed, her voice filled with relief. Daniel nodded, exhaustion washing over him. "Yeah, we did." But as the smoke cleared, they both knew this was just the beginning. The Kravak were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The war was far from over. The Verundi vessel shook violently as Daniel and Silura scrambled to their feet, the remnants of the explosion still echoing in their ears. The Kravak ship was crippled, but the battle outside raged on. Every second felt like a lifetime, the weight of what they had done pressing down on them. Daniel glanced at Silura, whose normally composed face now revealed a flicker of uncertainty. "We need to get back to the Verundi ship. We can't stay here," he said, urgency thick in his voice. Silura nodded, but there was a heaviness in her movements. Something was different. "The Kravak will retaliate soon," she muttered, her eyes scanning the darkened corridors. "We bought ourselves time, but not much." Together, they moved back through the ship, their steps quick and cautious. The once oppressive corridors of the Kravak vessel now felt more ominous, as if the ship itself had turned against them. The lights flickered, the hum of power replaced by eerie silence. As they approached the airlock, Daniel couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. His instincts screamed at him to keep moving, but his mind was already weighing the choices ahead. "Silura," he said, stopping abruptly, "we can't just keep reacting to the Kravak. If we don't find a way to end this, it'll never stop." Silura paused, her amber eyes narrowing as she turned to face him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, we need to find a way to strike back. Harder. Hit them where it really hurts, not just slow them down," Daniel replied, his voice hardening. "They'll keep coming for your people and mine if we don't." Silura's gaze softened for a moment, the twin hearts within her chest beating in sync with the tension in the air. "You think like a warrior," she said, her mandibles twitching as she considered his words. "But we're outnumbered, outgunned. What could we possibly do?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of clanging metal stopped him cold. They both turned, weapons raised, as the bulkhead behind them creaked open, revealing a group of Verundi soldiers. "Commander Silura, human," the lead soldier said, his voice robotic through the translator device in his helmet. "The Kravak ship is destabilizing. We have to evacuate immediately." Daniel exhaled, lowering his rifle slightly. "Looks like we're out of time." Silura gave him a look that was equal parts agreement and frustration. "Let's go." The group hurried back to the Verundi ship, the airlock sealing behind them just as the Kravak vessel began to collapse under its own failing systems. They could feel the rumble as the Verundi ship pulled away, leaving the crippled enemy craft to drift helplessly in space. As they reached the bridge, the atmosphere was tense. The Verundi captain's eyes flicked between the tactical readouts and Silura as she entered. "Commander," he said gravely, "the Kravak forces are regrouping. We have only minutes before they strike again." Silura's mind raced, the enormity of the situation settling in. She knew the Kravak wouldn't just retreat, not after the damage she and Daniel had inflicted. And even though their own ship was still holding together, it wouldn't survive another direct assault. "We have to leave this sector," the captain continued. "Our mission is to protect the fleet, not engage in battles we can't win." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You run now, and they'll chase you all the way back to your homeworld. You think this is just about one ship? The Kravak want more than a single victory. They want domination." The captain glared at him, clearly not used to humans speaking so boldly aboard his ship. But before he could respond, Silura stepped forward. "He's right," she said, her voice steady. "We can't keep running. If we don't stop them here, they'll crush us. All of us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crew, but the captain remained silent, his eyes locked on Silura. She could feel the weight of leadership on her shoulders. Decisions like this weren't just tactical, they were personal. The fate of her people, her world, was tied to every choice she made. But Daniel's words echoed in her mind. There had to be another way, something beyond retreat, beyond mere survival. Suddenly, an idea sparked. "The Kravak have a command ship, right?" she asked, her mind already working through the details. The captain frowned, nodding slowly. "Yes, it's leading their fleet. If we can get to that ship," Silura continued, "we could take out their leadership, decapitate the entire operation." Daniel's eyes widened slightly, catching on to her plan. "A targeted strike. Cut the head off the snake, and the rest of the fleet will scatter." The captain looked skeptical. "You're suggesting we attack their command ship? With what?" Silura's mandibles twitched. "Not with a full assault. We infiltrate, like we did with the power core. Daniel and I can lead a small team, get aboard their ship, and take out their command structure." Silence fell over the bridge as the crew processed the audacity of her proposal. The captain's gaze shifted to Daniel, who stood beside Silura, unwavering. "You're willing to risk your life for this?" Daniel met his eyes without hesitation. "If it means stopping the Kravak, yeah. I'll risk it." The captain exhaled slowly, his posture stiffening. "Then you have my support," he said reluctantly. "But this will be a suicide mission if it fails." Silura glanced at Daniel, the weight of the moment settling over them both. This was it, their one shot to turn the tide of the war. Success meant survival. Failure meant death, not just for them, but for their entire species. "We won't fail," Silura said firmly, her resolve hardening. Daniel nodded in agreement, his stormy eyes meeting hers. "Let's finish this." As they turned to prepare for the mission, a deep sense of unity settled between them. A bond forged in battle, but one that went beyond strategy and survival. For Silura, this mission wasn't just about duty anymore. It was about something far deeper, something she hadn't fully understood until now. And for Daniel, the growing connection with Silura fueled his determination. He knew that this fight, this war, wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about protecting something precious, something worth fighting for. As they armed themselves for the final assault, both of them knew the risks. But in that moment, with the fate of two worlds hanging in the balance, neither was willing to back down. The storm was coming, and they would face it together. The Verundi ship glided through the blackness of space, silently approaching the massive Kravak command vessel. Every step of the plan had been meticulously coordinated. Silura and Daniel stood in the briefing room with the small strike team, their faces illuminated by the holographic display of the Kravak ship. "We go in fast," Silura explained, her voice steady, betraying no hint of fear. "Once inside, we disable their security systems and head straight for the command deck." Daniel stood beside her, his eyes scanning the layout. "We're looking for the leadership. If we can take out their commanding officer, we throw their entire fleet into chaos." The soldiers nodded, but the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone understood the stakes. This wasn't just a mission. It was a final gamble to end the war. As the briefing ended, Silura caught Daniel's eye. For a moment, the weight of everything hung between them, their connection, the danger ahead, and the uncertain future that awaited. But there was no time for words. Instead, she simply nodded, a silent promise that they would face whatever came next together. Minutes later, the team was aboard a stealth shuttle, making its final approach toward the Kravak command vessel. The dark, hulking ship loomed ahead, its jagged surface broken by the occasional glimmer of light from inside. The shuttle slipped into a blind spot in the ship's sensor array, docking in one of its lower bays. "We're in," whispered one of the Verundi soldiers, their voices barely audible in the tight confines of the shuttle. Silura and Daniel led the way, moving swiftly and silently through the Kravak ship's corridors. The tension was electric, every step a calculated risk as they pushed deeper into the enemy's heart. They encountered minimal resistance at first. The initial Kravak guards were taken out swiftly, the strike team's expertise shining through. But the deeper they went, the thicker the opposition became. "Hold them off here," Silura ordered, gesturing for half the team to remain behind to create a defensive line. "We'll press on." Daniel and Silura, accompanied by a few elite soldiers, pushed forward toward the command deck. The air grew heavier, the hum of the ship's power core reverberating through the walls. The Kravak were now aware of their presence, and the fight was becoming desperate. Blaster fire echoed through the corridors as they cut their way through waves of Kravak soldiers. Silura's movements were swift and lethal, her precision unmatched. Daniel fought beside her, every strike measured, every step calculated. Finally, they reached the entrance to the command deck. The massive doors stood before them, heavily fortified and sealed shut. "This is it," Daniel muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Silura stepped forward, planting an explosive charge on the door's lock. "Once we breach, we go straight for their commander." The team braced as the explosion rocked the corridor, and the door slid open with a groaning creak. Inside, the command deck was a stark contrast to the rest of the ship, sleek, glowing with alien technology, and at its center stood the Kravak commander. He was a towering figure, clad in battle armor, his eyes glowing with a fierce intelligence. Around him, Kravak officers turned in shock as the Verundi and human teams stormed in. "Now," Silura shouted. The battle was brutal. The Kravak commander was far stronger than anything Daniel or Silura had faced before. He fought with a calculated fury, his movements swift and relentless. The Verundi soldiers struggled to keep up, their weapons barely making a dent in his defenses. Silura lunged, her blade meeting the commander's with a resounding clash. Sparks flew as they fought, each strike met with brutal resistance. Daniel flanked the commander, trying to find an opening in his defenses, but every time he struck, the Kravak anticipated his moves, blocking him with ease. They were running out of time. Desperation fueled Daniel as he looked for any weakness, any advantage they could exploit. And then he saw it. A small gap in the commander's armor, exposed for just a moment as he turned to strike at Silura. Without hesitation, Daniel moved in. He thrust his weapon into the gap, and with a surge of adrenaline, he drove it deeper, twisting with all his might. The Kravak commander let out a roar of agony, his movements faltering. Silura seized the moment, her blade flashing as she struck a lethal blow, severing the commander's armor and bringing him to his knees. It was over. The remaining Kravak officers, witnessing the fall of their leader, hesitated. Confusion and fear rippled through them, and within moments, the Verundi soldiers had subdued the last of the resistance. Breathing heavily, Daniel and Silura stood over the fallen commander, their bodies aching from the fight. But it wasn't just physical exhaustion that weighed on them. It was the enormity of what they had just accomplished. The Kravak fleet would be thrown into chaos without their leader. This victory, this single strike, could turn the tide of the war. Daniel looked at Silura, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The connection between them, forged through battle and shared purpose, now felt even deeper. "You did it," Daniel said softly, his voice full of admiration. "We did it," Silura corrected, her amber eyes softening as they met his. There was a quiet moment between them, a moment of understanding, before the crackling voice of the Verundi captain came through their comms. "The Kravak fleet is retreating. You've done it. Prepare for extraction." As they made their way back to the shuttle, Daniel couldn't help but feel the weight of the future pressing down on him. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Still, In that moment, as the stars stretched out before them, he felt a strange sense of hope. Silura sat beside him in the shuttle, her eyes focused on the stars as well. "This isn't the end," she said quietly, echoing his thoughts. "No," Daniel agreed, "but it's a start." And as the Verundi ship carried them away from the battlefield, back to the safety of their own fleet, Daniel knew that whatever came next, he and Silura would face it together, human and Verundi, bound by a shared fight for survival, and something more. The connection they had forged, tested in the crucible of battle, was something neither of them would forget. As the stars blurred into light, and the Kravak threat receded behind them, Daniel glanced at Silura, feeling the weight of what they had achieved. He smiled, knowing that, in the end, it wasn't just victory that they had won. It was trust, it was hope. It was the beginning of something new. The end.